Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on philosophy, logic, and an introduction to Indian, Greek, and Chinese logic, and why we should or shouldn't talk to anyone or argue with me. So this is another concluding part to a talk I was giving, which is an introductory part to logic and the history of logic, formal and informal, as best as all possible. And so this continues the video just before why talk to anyone and what is logic. So this is more about what is logic, what is thought, and I will again try to work through the material slowly, talk by talk, because I do like talking this out. Again, talking anything out at whatever length you should or shouldn't, to whatever degree, is a lot of what logic is. So, ancient Indian, Greek, and Chinese philosophers who argued about how language and arguments work and what they tell us are known plenty, especially in modern post-60s terminology, as logicians, sometimes grammarians in 60s, 70s texts. For example, there were logicians of ancient Athens other than Aristotle, but his syllogisms were the most famous forms of argument for many Muslims and Christians, the two largest cultures the world has seen, with Buddhism close by. As just mentioned in other classes, the three largest cultures. Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, gave us many examples of what can be said with certainty, given syllogisms, because Lewis Carroll does a lot of Aristotle, as I will mention more of later. Such as, no lizards have hair, no lizards, pardon me, have hair, and no bald creatures need a hairbrush, and if you assume not having hair is being bald, then so no lizard needs a hairbrush. But Carroll also cautioned us against following the form and neglecting content and context very much, such as the passage of time, giving the false example, the meat I eat is the meat I buy, and the meat I buy is raw, so the meat I eat is raw, because something has gone through a process. I don't think he knew of the tree falling in the forest, but actually the tree falling in the forest would not make a sound because it would have to go through a process, very similarly. Which does make this a bit zen. I do like, and I believe later here, is the wall problem, so I will mention that if it isn't right here in a moment. Consider a logic puzzle mentioned by Roy Sorensen. In 1889, Senator John William Harold married his widow's sister. Senator Harold married the sister of the woman who was his wife when he died. How did he do it without dying beforehand? Is it all a terrible legal mistake? If Harold married one sister, she died, and then he married the other sister, and then he died, he married his widow's sister before her sister was a widow, which he later made her when he died. So the trick is that he did not marry his widow's sister at once. Not all at once, like the meat in the market, or the tree in the forest making the sound through the ears. In hindsight, we can say and state truly that what no one would or could at either wedding, that Harold did marry his widow's sister. If logic is the study of what can be said with certainty, this is a confusing way of something that you can say logically with certainty about the whole. But like a lot of Taoism and Zen, you would put it contradictory-wise on purpose in order to make it seem, at first, unless you go through specific, very simple motions, illogical and contradictory. Some would say you can resolve all contradictions if you can, so there are no true contradictions. I tend to be more so, of course, contradictions are real, and sometimes, and only sometimes, we resolve them. And even then, sometimes it's amicable, or plays nice. Either ways. But it would be a confusing way of saying only afterward, as it wouldn't have been logical to say at the time. Of course, but when I tell you something, did I mean I'm saying it right now, or I would have said it then? These two are confusingly the same sometimes and not always, so they overlap. Sometimes I tell you things as if I'm telling you afterwards. Sometimes I tell you things as if they're from the perspective of people right then. That twists the two back against each other. Which is the joke and the puzzle. If she had known, she might not have married him. That's another joke, for the ladies. Fellas, Take it outside. Yeah. For Aristotle, as for Heraclitus and many other ancient thinkers, the world is logical because the world is intentionally designed, directed and ordered around with language by the gods, not necessarily all pleasantly so. Much as the book of Genesis says, let there be light, and as a command, and light and darkness separate like the units of an army, commanded by a king, I already rattled off about. If the world is created by language, all these ancient cultures know what a metaphor is. Colors, yes. Our mixed flavors are fire, though. So if the world is created by language and my screw-ups before underlying time, then human language can be logical, correct, and in line with the structure of the world. But if the world is not structured with human-like words, whether or not there are gods in the ancient or modern world, reality does not have to conform to human logic, or does or doesn't, talk or thought. We have enough trouble sticking to our own words, let alone discovering a world in line with them. And humanity seems to disagree with itself on everything as much as agree. Here again, I am not questioning so much as religion or science, as much as saying human beings, like I mentioned with the previous example. When you say words, it's hard to know how literal or figurative they are, and they can be both at the same time for all kinds of people, and you can accuse it of either, unfortunately. Fortunately, well, it still survives. All around, I've heard. Around 2500 BCE, over 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago in ancient Egypt, 2,000 years before there were lectures on logic in Athens, Ptah-hotep, who some call the first genuine philosopher in human history, wrote many wise things about saying things and not saying things. He's very concerned with speech and thus logic. Saying things to others, but he also says say less and listen instead, and that's quite logical in the backs and the forths. How much should logic be listening rather than speaking, and still thus using words, just not yours? Of course, they're all the same words. It's a language. A lot of back and forth, a lot of what have yous, a lot of ins and outs here, dude. Ptah-hotep says speaking is harder than all other work. As love to say, apparently pulling giant stone triangles into the desert isn't as hard as speaking, but the Egyptians would know that's because speaking is the only thing that orders the triangles. Perhaps ordered by the gods. Or not, or ancient engineers. Hearing well is speaking well, he says. Those who can't hear others are fools who can't do anything. See the bad as good, do everything everyone hates, and are blamed for everything every day. He says, don't be the jerk. You know that guy throughout history, right? Yeah, that guy. Not always a guy, but always a jerk. Ptah-hotep tells us to talk to everyone, those who speak foolishly and wisely, as there is no limit to speaking wisely, and wise words can be found even in the lowliest of people, even the maidens at the grindstone. Silence is better than chatter. Say what you see, not what you hear, Ptah-hotep says. If it isn't important, don't say anything. Very much like the Buddha said later, about 2,000 years later. Speak when you know you have a solution. Don't let your stomach do the talking. Listen to others who need to talk, and they won't try to defeat you with words. When you speak, don't lean to one side, or your judging words will turn into words others use to judge you. With the flip, like the language, as I said, and still do. You don't have to talk to enemies, as the stronger will say things to others that get them in trouble, and the weaker will turn on themselves with words. Mike Pence hasn't said a lot, perhaps he is very wise. Ptah-hotep and Aristotle, like Gautama of India, Moza of China, Avicenna of Persia, Aquinas of Italy, Mill, Boole, Carroll, Venn, Russell, and many other thinkers we will study, argue that we live in a rational world insofar as we speak correctly and only speak when we speak the truth. Given how much changes with perspective and time, this does make speaking truly logically and illogically, or falsely even, a lot. Very hard. It's hard to get away with. I have a philosophy meme I really like and I show people all the time. It shows the memes for the children. It shows the French postmodern philosopher Lyotard, and he says it was his great uncle, I think, it was the man on the flying trapeze for whom the Lyotard was made, originally stitched. Quite close to the skin. My words should be closer to the material. Stating, dissensus, not consensus, is the real point of communication, which is actually very postmodern. Disagreement, not agreement, is the real point we use to talk to each other and love you, mon ami, because the best is very much silence and the back and the forth, you understand. Yes, vive la différence between me and this interpretation. So, He means disagreement, not agreement, is really what happens when we talk. And that's awesome. He's like, and you can love it, and it is his life. You know, the back to the forth, like the liar with the bow. Again, bring me a small liar, as Mel Brooks says. I was lying. The check was in the mail, you know. The class responds to Lyotard lecturing them at the lectern. He says, dissensus really disagree. They're like, we totally agree. All the students, stupid Americans. And Lyotard says, damn it. Damn all. You know. Them all to heck, you know. It's, we are agreeing or disagreeing more, less, or equally. You know, the point of talking about anything with anyone, you know, whether or not the one is in France. So my logic text for UC Berkeley, this is going to be a fun one, you know, was born just around the time that I was. The logic book, 1980, my copy is from 98, you know, it's an old code. But it still checks out, sadly. And it begins with a few paragraphs on what formal logic is, and why it is good and useful, that I don't find quite good or useful at all, so not all that talked out and logical, I would with the editors, you know, that illustrate very well why this here is going to be a series of talks and a class which considers time, change, and learning, which we've just talked about much, from the mistakes of everyone and learning from all that about the mistakes we're going to make in our lives and hopefully as a species far into the future if we continue to have the same brains and minds as well as logic, which is not just good, but all reasoning, you know, or how you define it. If it's good, then I guess there must also be bad, hopefully if we survive. It says in the beginning, historically two overlapping concerns have driven research in deductive logic. We already have questions. It's not just all of human thinking or even reason, specifically deductive logic. Remember all the times when you just used deductive logic and didn't use anything else? Well, I wasn't with you, so I don't. The desire, why do we have desires? I thought we were being logical, Captain. To formulate canons, you duck, or principles of good reasoning in everyday life and science, it says in the brackets. In everyday life and science. Not an art? I don't know. And the desire to formalize and systematize existing and emerging work in math and science. Once again, we have science repeated. So it's very logic is very formulaic, it's very ordered, and it lives very nearby math and science, we're told. Common to these concerns is the view that what distinguishes good reasoning from bad reasoning, what makes deductive reasoning logical by itself again, we've paired it off, as opposed to illogical, and they put these in scare quotes. They quote themselves in their own words to put it loosely for themselves, to not be caught up entirely in a bracket right where they're trying to proceed where logic could be a bracketed black and white affair here entirely. Truth preservation is the most important thing, not lie preservation, not all meaning semantic preservation. Truth. Happy, again, somebody asks Zen Master Joshu, what are true words? He says, okay, your mother is ugly. You know, those are true enough, I guess. You know, it's also sensitive and emotional. I don't know. Those are also things that exist. You know, I'm always emotional whenever I talk. So are these people, because they want to preserve truth, which is like, that's not all of talk. Sometimes we're questioning things. Sometimes we're saying, maybe A or B, and we leave it open. It's not always just truth preservation, but that's one way of describing it, but it's rather positivistic, and it already suggests, it puts it in scare quotes what logical and illogical is. It's going to say it's truth preservation, almost like it's Darwinian, but then we're going to quickly have, it needs to be entirely separated, unlike any two things in life, or even truth or lies, because the world may be more complicated than just formal logic, and it may not be, as Wittgenstein says in his later work, and I would say shows very much. My formal logic is not the underlying layer or level of the mind, nor could be math, nor could be life. Rather, life underlies it all, keeps going, in spite of itself. So, the hallmark, the text keeps going, of good deductive reasoning is that if we start from truths, permanent fixed things you can always rely on in life, like mortal human beings, texts that disintegrate sometimes, and use good reasoning, not bad, not average, good reasoning. You know when you do that. We will always arrive at truths and never at falsehoods. This is some of the stuff I love about positivism. They say they like science. They don't want to fail and learn from failure because they want science to always be right, which is anything like, even if there is a scientific method, which would fail a lot and learn from failure. The text keeps going on. That was my aside. Because we are all interested, all of us, as students and scholars, in everyday life and our careers. Of course, as scholars, we can't be concerned with both of those anymore. In gaining truth and avoiding falsehoods. That's right. That's what we do as we live, as we have. The past 10 years, we've gained truth and avoided falsehood. That's exactly what this prepares you to deal with. We have all reason to be interested in Lewis Carroll. So you think that you guess that you can understand it. We have reason to be interested. No, we're just interested in things. But we also have reason to be interested in things, but that's already confusing. We have reason to be interested, desire again, in good reasoning in the above sense, which we put in different scare quotes. So if that made total sense to you, it shouldn't, because I don't understand it much. Now, I do understand what they're trying to get to. They're trying to drive a wedge in here and say they can separate truth from false. And that's how they do it in that language. That was my logic textbook. So I went on to do Sudoku, knock it out, and not understand this part. But of course, most people just flip, over the first chapter and all this. So I guess most don't care what they say. So before we continue, or consider if we can still have careers, what reason do we all have in particular to be interested in good reasoning as opposed to bad reasoning and human reasoning, which isn't the pieces of good reasoning? And yeah, I get it, but it can be blinding to say such a thing so simply. Again, is psychology interested in good human thought? Is that scientific? I think they're interested in more than just good human thought. I sure as heck hope they're being paid to be more than interested in good human thought. This is very Frege also, and I am in Learn from Hans Sluga at UC Berkeley, and like his book on Frege, and it says, Frege says there's boundary stones of reason, and then we just kind of slosh past it occasionally. So we have reasoning, and it sloshes past good reasoning. Does it use that with the slosh or the stone or the what? How do we slosh past good reasoning in ourselves with reasoning? We'll pursue that later. But that's actually very much here. Frege's the guy who sets these people up to say anything like this, of course, much later. And he's like, it's fluid, it's solid, it's all that. I'm going to use a metaphor, that makes us feel nice. Now let's go on to talk about binary logic, Well, I'm glad we set ourselves up poetically to be mathematical later. I'll talk of Poe in later affairs, and how he loves these people not so much. Of course, he can't love these people. He didn't live, until they were born. But yes, before we continue, this was the 80s, or consider if we can still have careers. Yes, I'm going to just paraphrase myself, leap right back into the notes. What principles of good reasoning? It says principles of good reasoning. Now, this is another thing. If you want to think I'm some sort of jerk, he's some freewheeling anarchist, as Mr. Burns says in The Simpsons. What principles of good reasoning do you have so far? Okay, count up your years, quantize them. Now I want you to ask me how many principles, I'll ask you first. How many principles of good reasoning do you have? But not bad reasoning. Principles that you always use, and then, it's not a maxim. You don't just use that reasoning some of the time. Whenever you use it, it's good reasoning. Be very careful before you say religion or science, do history. So what principles, again, since Sumer, of good reasoning do you or anyone you know have? Honestly, that's nice Hallmark card talk, but it's not strict science in the slightest. What principles of reasoning has science established, or psychology? It can show you practices. Are they showing you principles? Here again, you can have culture, and you have it, and you like it. It's fine. But what principles are in the mind? And here, think of other cultures. If you have principles and you don't think they have them, and if they ever have good reasoning, what principles do they have? How important is it in science, life, or anything else to always arrive at truth and never at falsehood? So we learn by not making mistakes. That's just nonsense. What is avoiding falsehood? Ducking it on the street? Let's not see him coming. Ignoring it in the press? It could never be telling a lie like George Washington did before or after he perhaps cut down a cherry tree, could it? Perhaps this is a legend. Maybe we shouldn't tell it anymore. Let's be complete and utter positivists. Should I have avoided the example? Am I misleading you with all this? I'm going to talk about George Washington. He's dead. Is that misleading to you? He's still in the, do you think he's above ground coming after you with the wooden teeth, a clacking? Yes, I want to make horrible horror puns, I won't. But should we all avoid lies or engage with them? What are you doing here? Do we know when we lie, or does trying to avoid lying make us self-aware of our lying or less? How about if you tell yourself you have principles and then I ask you where are yours and you can't name any of them? How about that? Is that lying to you? Is that overstating the case? Or is that you being good and open-minded to everyone? All I know is it probably ticks both you and I off equally, although in opposite directions. Heraclitus in Greece, Confucius of China, and Nietzsche of Germany would all tell us to try, fail, and learn from failure. Confucius is great at that. He is not Nietzsche at all, but Nietzsche is very much like Confucius, oddly, in many ways, but then very much not Confucius. But one of the things Confucius and Nietzsche share, in spite of being very different thinkers in ancient China and pre-modern, modern-ish Germany of the 1800s, is that, failure's great. You know what I mean? I mean, if you're not a complete jerk and run right in front of a bus, but I mean, if failure's great, are you kidding? You want to toughen yourself up for that. You want to be, gobbling it up. Like, what are you talking about? I did see somebody a long time ago, I'm reminded, somebody said something horrifying online, and somebody said, thank you for being dirt, out of which I can be a flower, out of which I can grow, and it's like, yes, way to tick off, everyone, that's the way, kill them with kindness, you know what I mean? That's the way to do it, all right? As Confucius said, gotta piss off the wicked, not trying to make everybody happy. What kind of a comedy routine is this? So his argument about perfection and preservation, is that what it is? Growth day by day from perfect to perfect. I see, that's self-awareness. Wittgenstein says we use too few examples all too often. If you only have one self, how could you? And the only two historical examples the text gives us are the two Greeks, Euclid and Aristotle, the axiomatic geometer and syllogistic logician. We are told Euclid may have been the first to develop a reasonably complete axiomatic system, and they just think it's okay to say this for Greek, the first, it may have been the first. No mention of any other cultures, nor need to. And there's examples. It's just the first Greek person to do anything like it. Father of history, father of this, father of medicine. Maybe, now the modern texts say. They don't need to care elseways. It's a real crowd pleasers, with no metrics or further explanation of what distinguishes an axiomatic system from any sort of system, nor what makes a system reasonably complete as opposed to completely complete. To what degree is Euclid complete? What kind of an incompleteness theorem is standing between us and it? We are told Aristotle, at the same time nearby, and I like Aristotle plenty, but he's not my favorite guy, but I'm going to do a lot of Aristotle critically this semester because of Alice. And I am going to compare a lot the 10 categories to Alice. I already have my work up on that, but I'm going to do more talks. I do think Aristotle's categories are central to Wonderland, The Looking Glass, and The Hunting of the Snark, but I am critical of Aristotle. Lewis Carroll was very critical of Aristotle, also critical of Boole, ancient and modern logic, and trying to fit it all and shoehorn it into math and something like pre-computer, pre-telephone forms. But we're just being told it's sort of like a more telephone-like computer system is good. That's kind of what this is doing, and assuming that's best, which would just be justifying the motions we already make a lot and suggesting the systems are good, which is the kind of crown-pleasing cheerleading you expect out of every human being of every culture to some degree. They're getting in where they fit in. You know what I mean? As the Bard used to say. So, that's again, and usually when people say things are systematic, they almost never give you a metric by which you would know that, and of course things can be more or less ordered, I mean, again, as with all this stuff, no, it's more or less reasonable, more or less ordered to say all this. If you're like, but it's somewhat, yes, I get it. But hopefully, again, turn the other way, and as Lin Ji says, see me at last here. Turn your head as you stare at this and see me at last. And it's like, no, there's ways to see that this is not as systematic as people just insist one ways it is. And then we still very much have a lot of folks trapped in that kind of thinking. According to Wittgenstein, the last great genius of philosophy, he died in 1950, 51. I'd have to look it back up, but possibly 49, something like China. But yes, it's basically, yeah. I don't know, who knows? So, I mean, dying, rebirth, reborn to die again, all of that stuff. So, it's a real duck rabbit. But it's all one and the same with the Tao, perhaps. Still then. So, we are told Euclid, again, develops this axiomatic system. We're told Aristotle has some perfect syllogisms. At the same time, it is said he was not the first person to try to reason well or point out errors in argument. This seems tacked on in later editions, possibly in the 60s. But he was the first in the Western world. And oftentimes you find this language, it's like it's extra, it's not the first, but first in the Western world, not Western Europe, not the Western Roman Empire, but highly identified with both. To offer at least the outlines, listen to this language, quote, to offer at least the outlines of a comprehensive system for codifying and evaluating a very wide range, relative talk, of arguments and reasoning. He's very precise and very strict about kind of a wide-ranging bunch of topics in argument and precision. That's great, and actually what I expect out of a text, and out of human beings. It's just the part where he's absolutely precise and perfect with only 4 forms of syllogism, and that's everything, and it's not really in human psychology or reasoning, and he knows that well, and is plenty all throughout his stuff in the rangings of his reasonings and possible lecture notes. They leave this open such that it can accommodate Aristotle. It's very similar to a lot of people want to strictly define science. They've found, I've heard, this is very Feyerabend, the more strictly you define it, and Newton stops being a scientist, so a lot of people don't strictly define it because they really want the first white guy to wear a wig and do algebra a lot, who helps with calculus along with Leibniz, to be a scientist. So even though he tried to turn more lead into gold and didn't, he still has to be a scientist to folks because that's what they identify with it. It doesn't matter. Again, it doesn't have principles. It's cultures. You know what I mean? So Isaac Newton did enough. He is a scientist. It doesn't have anything to do with what he did all day entirely. You don't know that. Maybe he ate yogurt all day. Gets hit in the head with an apple. Has an idea. Well, again, as Anaxagoras says, no two things can be split with an axe. That's the butterfly flaps its wings. So, I don't know how axiomatic that is. I don't know how many points I made, and I'm not sure how much that's a tangent or how round tangents are. Never seen them none. But I do know that Aristotle is the first guy in the Western world, though he wasn't in Western Europe at all. And of course, Western Europeans are not converting to Greek Orthodox anytime soon. Plenty. Or opening all their borders, that he thinks that, basically the textbook tells us confidently that he kind of was the first person who's Western, which means after Auschwitz very white. He's supposedly the first white guy who says white is being sickly and pale and wouldn't identify with the color. That he's basically kind of the first precise logician kind of argument. Well, I don't know how arguable that is, and obviously I'm arguing against it. So the text goes on to give us two examples of good reasoning, which are both terrible, as Lewis Carroll well would have known and hopefully ridiculed if he had them offered. I'll get into more. I am indebted to Carroll scholars about this kind of stuff. You find good reasoning, and then they set you up with modern formal logic, the kind Lewis Carroll was suspicious about Boole passing on to folks like he wouldn't have known Frege, although Sluga knows full well who Frege is. And basically, this is good reasoning, although, as others have mentioned, this is formal logic setting you up to have a final answer in life, but life doesn't do that very often, does it? So Sarah and Hank are the only finalists for a position with Bowles, Blithers, and Blimey. That's a great name. I wish I had come up with that. An accounting firm, It's BBB also, too, which sounds like these logicians have read Carroll, sadly. So whomever is hired, maybe that should have been whomever in their case, will have a baccalaureate degree in accounting. So you got to fight people for that today, or back then. It was the 80s. And so people tied ties around their heads and hollered at the moon. But I'm from the hate, Hank will get his baccalaureate in accounting only if he passes all the courses he is taking this semester. Sarah will get her baccalaureate only if she passes all her courses and gets an A in each of them. Hale will fail logic, and Sarah will get a B in Principles of Accounting 306. Here we have psychic premonitions about exactly what will happen in the future, which allows us then to calculate, so none of the finalists will be hired by Bowles, Blithers, and Blimey. Now, this is using pieces of your reasoning. It couldn't not, but it's using pieces of your reasoning in a way you would never encounter them in life because it's like, well, what about a real problem? I always told my students in logic, when I had first logic class I taught, it's like, okay, give me an A to a B to a C. They're like, okay, on a Thursday it's like, stop. You're too good. No. If I have a turtle, it's like, okay, on a Thursday I kind of feel like, no, that is, Aristotle cannot handle anything like that all at once. A supercomputer like your brains, all internetworked. Like, yeah, sure, yours and mine. I mean, we can handle all that, but easily. Formal logic and syllogisms can't, because if on a Thursday, you've just gone beyond every formal, four perfect syllogisms and perfect black and white certainty by saying kind of on a Thursday. Now we have subjective truth in time and space and all sorts of things Lewis Carroll wondered about and interwoven together with the categories, so we're not really doing formal Boolean post-Aristotle logic with being so complicated. We have premonitions that we know Sarah will get a B. We already know that ahead of time, you know what I mean? Maybe the Russians are hacking. In Principles of Accounting 306, that is very principled reasoning ahead of time, so real it's unnatural, you know what I mean? This is magic coming out of nowhere. So none of the finalists will be hired, and that's very sad. Maybe these people are cynical about logic and philosophy in the real world succeeding and making any money. This problem sets up the answers. Notice how it would have to be framed by passion, otherwise it could not operate. That's a bit Frege. I don't know if he has, well, he doesn't have any more problems with the passions. So this problem sets up the answer to prove logic and demonstrate things. But note the strange future knowledge that lets us come to an obvious conclusion. We are told that A or B will be C if A does B and B does E. But then we are told exactly and precisely that A won't do D and B won't do E immediately afterwards. So anyone with half a mind on what they are saying would not be wondering about the candidacy of either A or B. This would be a non-starter, right? If you had all premonitions, you would not even go through the motions, right? What I said earlier. You would not even go through these motions if you had this set of knowledge. It's you just X, okay, no. Now, there's a lot, see, that's logic. That's what you do. That is not what you use logic to do. Poe says, the most brilliant of thinking is not certainty, but possibility. And that could even be said in formal logic a lot. It's not really certainty to certainty to certainty. It's playing with ors, ands and ors, that with little oars or little hands are plied. Yes? Although the girls, I don't think, did the rowing that day. That basically with oars, with choices that would be open, you would have to make decisions. That's Aristotle says. What is human? What is rational? What raises us above the beasts? It would be making choices using oars with little hands, and then adult hands are plied, and minds. We make choices between A and B. And this is a place where if you were a computer and had this program, you would just automate this whole thing and a human being would never have heard of it. You know what I mean? Yes, I understand reasoning could work that way. No, this is not a good example. No, it isn't. This is an example designed to set it up as if formal logic works in life, and this is not life. That is actually, I'm getting an idea from others, as Will mentioned, as work through the Carol work. I think it's William Bardley. I hope I'm getting that correct. He actually does go on a long tirade in his book Logic with Lewis Carroll, and I really am also indebted to that book. He knows that Lewis Carroll is staring at logic before it turns formal, and he knows that Lewis Carroll is weaving together things like passionate white rabbits and not, because he's worried about kind of making logic entirely mathematical and formal a bit. You can see it, and he is mocking the Mad Hatter as so. I think he's mocking Boole and others use the Mad Hatter to mock Russell after Frege, with good reason. Possibly desire. How would you know either one apart? Could be both, so I could say it either way, with good reason, with good interest. It would both be the same because both would, of course, run parallel, yes? Well, interwoven. Both would always be there. You could always count on it, so you could refer to it either way at the end, yes? Knowing our fellow human beings. I didn't say well. Who wants that? You already have you. Ask yourself this. So what axioms of good reasoning, however defined here or nowhere, did you use? They did not say, here's principles of reasoning, use them here. They said good principles of reasoning like this. That seems like we have strict knowledge in an absurd way such that it closes itself out. They did not use principles of when you have certain knowledge, it's extra certainty. That sort of it could be read into it. That's not a principle here. When have you had to call that into mind? I don't think you would have. Again, I like Wittgensteinian practices more than principles. I think we can speak past each other with those words, of course. Plenty. But what axioms or maxims or principles of absolute universal reasoning were here? What? With the Hawaiians, a push towards knowing things that are decently certain or absolutely so? Which things in Hawaii or here with tactile plates are absolutely certain and secure? Which insurance forms do you provide for, It is the way we reason, certainty to certainty plenty. Not entirely and absurdly this way, though. Again, the most brilliant reasoning is possibility, as Poe says, not certainty. And this is too certain to be anything like reasonable even, let alone bright. So, is it particular to math, science, or the work of Aristotle reasoning? How reasonable is surreal painting compared to other painting types? Just ballpark it immediately. And then compared to, say, doing test tubes while listening to an iPod, or anything, or doing theoretical chemistry and spacing out. Like, which one of those are principled activities? Try to find it. There are some who would say it's more the sciences than the arts. So count the principles in the sciences, count them in the arts, and show which one is more. I'm going to have I'll just call it a zero-sum game, At least those are the ratios and the rationale, as far as I'm concerned. So is this particular to math, science, anything? Or would a reasonable person follow this without formal logical training, as you did into it as a child, such that it can hardly qualify as particularly good reasoning and skill? The second example is even worse, given to show why Aristotle's syllogisms were not enough for later logicians who used connectives such as or, and, if, then, and not, without mentioning Chrysippus. Boole, Wittgenstein, or anyone else historically involved. Karen, it's actually Karen in the text. Again, she needs to speak to the assistant manager, sensei of your dojo. Assistant sensei, maybe the dojo. Karen is either in Paris or Nairobi. Think about that. We have a name Karen, and we're being told by logical people in the 1980s, who can feel for everyone apparently, that Karen is either in Paris or Nairobi. Now, I want you to ballpark at me. Again, why does Rorschach keep painting pictures of my parents fighting? But let's not go into Afrocentric. Why would Karen be in either Paris or Nairobi, and that's a nice or? We are then told she is not in Nairobi. Line B. I love this. So Karen is in Paris. Speaking to Paris's manager. I can't make that up, can I? No, I can quote it, though, and I can laugh, and I can move right by. So simple arguments, such as the above, it says in the text, are not readily represented within syllogistic logic. Let's hope not. Yet the above, I'd have to speak to their manager and editor. Yet the above argument is clearly an example of good reasoning. The text tells us that easy mechanical operation of exclusive or is a use of good reasoning. Whenever the first two sentences are true, no, I am not trying to just be like, it's biased. No, that is not an example of good reasoning, even if it was about Karen being in Wyoming or Walmart. No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't be that way either. Well, neither, would be good. The last sentence, it says whenever the first sentences are true, the last sentence is also true. Hilariously, this is wrong. This is not an example of good reasoning, but rather common sense, and it's not necessarily up to anything good here, nor is it generally. I'm going to actually cut out and go silently away from the other part, and I'll actually mention how or is inclusive in formal logic, so they get this wrong. As logicians, watch and learn my words. If you can watch them, I'd listen, or you can watch my mouth, read my lips. All sorts of taxes on either side of the aisle. So is it true that if the first and second sentences are true, then the third follows? There is no situation where an individual would say the first and second sentences together. If somebody says the first and then someone else reported the second, the third could be true, but not necessarily. That would involve more than one Karen or person, though. First, in the time between the first and second reports, Karen could go elsewhere if time is involved. This is exactly the kind of thing Derrida brings up as a postmodernist and other things as a post-Heideggerian. But what happens if this is to people talking? Yes, it seems tricky, but if you have different people talking, this is a telegram and an email. What if she left as the email, was unread? If it involves time, and if this necessarily involves motions in time, like I've already mentioned, if it's not static, but like for Aristotle, logic involves time and space, the caterpillar and the Cheshire cat, for Lewis Carroll, I will argue. If it involves the caterpillar and the cat, time and space, then Karen could have moved elsewhere, on her frequent flyer miles, in the meantime, on a supersonic jet. Too bad. And we know and understand it. No, it isn't completely airtight reasoning. But more than just that, because we haven't even gotten to the or, and that's the part about which the logician should be particularly and statically and isolatedly find import. Karen could go elsewhere by ship or plane, as Gautama of India might point out, or a Georgian peasant might insist, who couldn't all add up all the Karens into a wheelbarrow, wheel them over to the manager. Second, any of us moderns might think Paris or Nairobi are different places with different people, right? Well, we're set up to think that, but any formal logician should know. And it's loaded, isn't it? And I already implied how it's loaded, but watch what I'm going to do with the load here, yeah? Because it's a real load is what I'm telling you. Paris could be a neighborhood of Nairobi. Any formal logician should know that. This is very Lewis Carroll and other stuff. What happens if Paris is a neighborhood of Nairobi or Nairobi is a neighborhood of Paris? And what if I'm relying on you to suspect things about the people of Paris and Karen and Nairobi such that you wouldn't have thought that, as well as familiar place names that could stand for more than one Paris, as it does, as the guy and the cities. So, in this case, and given that time can pass, the second report would disconfirm the first, and good reasoning would assume, syllogistically along with Aristotle, that if Karen is not in Nairobi, she cannot possibly be in Paris. Back the other way, round the corner. Formal logic may be about rules and truth preservation, axioms or proper good speaking, or thinking that must be upheld. thinking that must be upheld, I'll repeat. I guess Deleuze and Guattari says truth is repetition. So is politics, it would seem. I didn't say it's much truth. But a history of logic, like I like to study, rather than this, would actually show you motions of logic and arguments in time and space, which is where people use them. And again, if this is good reasoning, I am sorry to mock it, but it's this kind of nonsense that again passes as good truth, and people call truth as opposed to all nonsense, which is just not the lies and truth intermix you need to deal with in your world. It's just not. People are not going to tell you obvious lies or obvious truths. They're going to tell you truths in the wrong place and time to get you, and then they'll say, but it's also true. And you have to know the similarity and the difference, not just the categorical differences here. It's, again, people have different sides of that, but they keep talking different sides of that. So really, this is not a new conversation at all. This is just more of the same, honestly, from both sides, again. So we don't have to assume there are unchanging rules. And I say this to all the religious, scientific people, everybody. It's like there's enough in religion, all of the major ones, that there are and aren't rules. It says that. That's, Lot's daughters. It's a whole lot of everything. It's a real pillar assault, I mean, it really licks. So the strategies of speaking and thinking that always lead to truth or war or not or victory are not necessarily all the same and all the same set aside from others. That should be followed without question and repeated, without speaking or thinking about them. Rather, speaking and thinking are practices, physical activities. Also, talking and thinking are, in a sense, physical mental activities altogether, that are also social and mental or psychosocial altogether, even if you have dualistic views beyond that. You also have more monistic views as that. So I let the other view have the first word, and Wittgenstein will have the last in this class. Of course, I will. And he's dead, but of course I will have some of his, yes? On the way, we will study human reasoning, arguments, fallacies, and the long history of Indian, Greek, Chinese, Islamic, medieval, and early modern, algebraic, and formal logic. Karen, because sticking to Karens, well, it gets rather sticky. For the first assignment for the logic class, if you are in the logic class, what I want you to do, and I am having students write and if you want to do this, watching the videos, please do. I encourage it. Again, don't send them all to me, though. Again, you can talk to me, just don't send me a bunch of essays, and, because I'll grade them and I'll be like, wait, you're not in the class? If you're not in the class. But, you could, again, try it. I encourage the exercise, even if you don't want to talk to me at all, and I don't want to talk to me at all. I don't need to. Write at least one typed double-spaced page about your thoughts on logic. Are there things everyone can agree to or should? I know your mind will be drawn immediately to this, that, and the other. Try to then talk that out as best as you can. I read good and bad and ugly philosophy essays. How many papers do you think I read that say something everybody thinks? I mean, of course, and then just goes on to not really provide examples and then assume things. Well, I can tell you human beings have never been like that in history or my classes ever. So this is not going to be the time, No, it isn't. So are there things everybody can agree to or should? Can you give examples? What principles of good reasoning are there? And are these basic to the mind or learned through culture? That is obviously a whole can of worms opening up on purpose. A real walnut to crack, So again, as possibly no two things are split with the axe, but people are trying to split the psycho from the social, and the true from the false. That is concluding the second part of a intro talk on the history of logic. And then after this, there will be more talks. Please watch and listen to. I have added Sun Tzu and the Art of War to this series of talks, and we'll put that in the lecture links and notes. Please watch the rest of this playlist and watch my other videos and playlists on the history of logic and history of thought and the history of Greek, Indian, Chinese, and modern, medieval, Islamic, everything. Thought, ancient Egypt, and back. It's about as far as we can go and read it. Can read faces today, though. Get a bit wiser. So, much love, much happiness to you and yours. Again, please enjoy these videos on logic. If you hate them, please think about them and do all kinds of things in opposition. That's where the magic happens. And I will see you, and argue with you probably if I do, if I ever see you.